Hi, welcome to the Carmen Branje show. I am Dr. Carmen Branje, and today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about research in the context of user experience design. The other day, I posted up something on LinkedIn. It was a journal article that was talking about why it's appropriate to only have 12 or so research participants in a qualitative research study. So I posted that up on LinkedIn, and there was a fair bit of response. So I figured I'd dig a little deeper into research in general and specifically academic papers. And we'll take a look at that specific paper that I posted up on LinkedIn just to give you an idea of how to go about reading through academic journal articles when doing user experience design research. Just going to check the levels here a little bit. Turn them down because I'm a little bit of a loud talker, as we all know. Test. Okay. So when before you do any type of research, you should check into what's already existing. Why go out and spend a bunch of money and a bunch of time looking or collecting information or studying things or trying to learn about things when there's probably somebody has already done that. There are thousands and thousands of academic institutions and other bodies. Lots of people publish research. It's not just academic institutions, and they make their work publicly available through journals a lot of the time. So in academia, that is the bread and butter of a lot of professors and researchers. Is that's sort of how their career is measured, is how often they publish and how high quality their work is, right? So I'm going to take you through how to look for academic papers, how to read through them, how to judge them, judge their criteria of if they're good or not, and then we're going to take a look at this actual paper that looks at only using 12 participants in a qualitative analysis. We're going to go through that and check it out in depth and look under the hood and see if it's really valuable as I think people would think it is. Okay, so the first thing that you'll need to do when you open up or when you're trying to find an academic or trying to read an academic journal is actually find it. So a really good place to look for journal articles is in Google Scholar. So Google Scholar is a subset of Google that only looks at academic peer-reviewed journals. So a peer-reviewed journal is, what that means is somebody, a group or a person has submitted a research paper to a journal. And then experts that work for that journal or volunteer for that journal will read through the paper and then maybe suggest some edits. So there's three options. Either they'll accept it and say, hey, this is great work, let's publish it. They'll say, this work is pretty good, but let's do a few changes. Or if the work is not of sufficient quality, then they might just reject the paper and say, no, we're not interested in publishing this. So remember, peer-reviewed doesn't necessarily mean perfect, or it's certainly possible for bad work to get through the peer revision process. However, it does give it a certain level of quality review, let's say, quality control. So it's not guaranteed, but I think in general, peer-reviewed research is a little bit better than non-peer-reviewed research. Or just there's a lot of sources of information on the internet. For example, like Medium articles and blog posts are things that anyone can really just post up. And it's not to say that there's not a lot of great work on platforms like that, but there aren't checks and balances. There isn't a peer review process, so you might more lower quality stuff might slip through the cracks. Okay, so a good place to start is on Google Scholar. So when we go here, we can, let's say we want to look up How many participants do I need for a study, for example? Okay, and then you'll see here there's tons of listings for all sorts of journal articles from all sorts of different sources. So a lot of times the actual paper will be available for you to download when you search on Google Scholar. So for example, here, looks like if we go in here, sometimes you can download the paper in this like sort of paper page. You can download it from there, or Google will often give you access to a PDF. A lot of times, if you just Google the paper article with PDF, you'll find a link to the paper. Now, unfortunately, some academic papers are behind a paywall. So that means there are a couple of options. If you are part of a university, if you're a student or a professor, like I am at York University right now, you have access to their repositories of journals. So you could, if you find a good journal article through Google Scholar and you can't access the actual paper via PDF in Google Scholar, go to your university library and search for that paper title. And usually you can access it there. Most universities have pretty extensive not really collections, but access to a lot of journals. So you can find it that way. Another little trick is sometimes if you can find the contact information for the authors, I'm sure if you email an author and say, hey, I'm really interested in your work, they would love that, and they would send you some version of their paper that they were able to send to you. So that's my way. That's how I usually start searching for academic papers, is to jump on to Google Scholar and start taking a look through there. So let's talk about journals in general. What makes a good journal? What makes a bad journal? Because they're not all created equal. I said there's a peer review process, and that means there's quality control, but I also said it's not guaranteed. So, anyone can post up on Medium or make a blog post, but almost as many people could just set up a journal, right? Especially an online journal now. There's not a lot of barriers. So you do have to be mindful of where the work is coming from. And that's not to say that it would be impossible for good work to come out of a poor journal, but your time is limited. You're not going to have, if you're a UX researcher, you're not going to have hundreds and hundreds of hours to pour through every word written by every researcher. So you have to use some tricks of the trade sometimes to help filter out the garbage from the good stuff. So one of the ways to do that is to look at journals that have a good reputation. So thankfully, the reputation of journals is quantified into a number into something called an impact factor. So an impact factor is just a number that they give journals. The higher the number, the better, essentially. So the sort of gold standard for scientific journals, academic research, are Nature and Science. So if there's going to be groundbreaking research, it's probably going to come out of one of those two journals usually. Or, well, I'll say the stuff that comes out of these two journals is usually groundbreaking. Now, again, even then it's not a guarantee that just because you're in Nature or Science and you've been peer reviewed that your work is any good, because there's been plenty of retracted articles that got published in Nature, and then later on, sometimes because researchers have fake data, or there was a mistake uncovered, then that article is retracted and they're like, oh, nope, sorry, never mind. So even using the rules of thumb, like, oh, go to a good journal, don't go to bad journals, it's not always a guarantee. So you have to use your critical thinking always. Your critical thinking hat needs to be on all the time. So I looked up the impact factor for Nature, and it's 43. Whatever that means. So, and Science is 41. So it's 2 less than Science, than Nature. But so what does that mean really? Well, it's just, is Nature really 2 better than Science? Not really. But then if you look at, so the journal that we're looking at, the paper that we're going to look at that has the article, How Many Interviews Are Enough? an experiment with data saturation and variability, it has an impact factor of, let's see here. I did a search. Sometimes they put it right on the page. Right. So at the top, currently it's 2. The impact factor is 2.0, which that seems to be like a lot of journals that I look through have a like a 1 or a 2. So I think 40 it seems to me to be really high, and maybe it's a logarithmic scale or something, or some nonlinear scale. Because I have seen journals and good work published in journals with a 2, but probably, if it's going under 1, that means that, at the very least, there's not a lot of people reading that journal. So it's not, whatever you publish in there won't be as impactful. Again, that's not to say that you can't have good work published in a journal with a low impact factor. Okay, so another thing that makes, or is an indicator of how good in quotes a article is how many times it's been cited. So this is why I say, this journal is the journal that we looked at, the journal of, what's it called? This journal is called Field Methods. So, and it had a impact factor of about 2. But if you look on Google Scholar, when you search for this paper, one thing to look at down here is the cited by statistic. That's a fairly important stat. That just means that that's how many other publications have referenced this publication. Now, that could be because all these publications are saying this study is terrible. That's usually not likely. So generally what I'm saying is the more times a paper is cited, usually that indicates there's something important here. So it might be something importantly bad or importantly good, but either way, it's important. So this paper has 11,000 citations. It was published in 2006. That's a lot of citations. And just to give you a reference, let's look up yours truly in Google Scholar. So when I was doing my PhD, I did some publishing. I was never a publishing guy. I like to build stuff. I was a developer and a designer a lot, and I dipped my hands in some research here and there. So here are some papers that I was authors on, either as a lead author or a contributing author. So here, top one here is about the Emoti chair, which is a project I worked on. It got cited by 47 times. No, that's not bad. It's certainly not 1,100. And then just to show you, colleagues of mine, my PhD supervisor was Deborah Fells, and I worked with someone named Katie Seaborn, and she is, I think she's teaching in Europe right now. Anyways, they wrote a paper, just to give you some comparison, some colleagues of mine. So they wrote a paper, it was cited 1,100 times. So I think 1,100, that's pretty good. I think if you see a paper that's been cited 1,000 times, that means a lot of people are reading it, a lot of people and have read it and thought it was impactful enough to write about it themselves. So then when we look at something like this, which 11,000, to me, that there's something there. So that's why we're going to go through this paper, because I think if 11,000 people have cited it, there's got to be something in there worth looking at. Okay, so we've gone through how to find an academic paper and how to sort of judge before actually looking at the content. This is totally judging a paper by its cover, a book by its cover, but that's sort of necessary because there is so much research out there. You won't have time to get through it all, so you want to focus on what at least is you have the best chance of it being the highest quality. So we talked about impact factor and citations and how to look up papers on Google Scholar and from the library and stuff. Okay, so let's actually take a look at the paper. So this paper is called How Many Interviews Are Enough? An Experiment with Data Saturation and Variability. So the first thing I would say about academic papers is I don't read them end to end. again, because I don't have a lot of time, I need to get to the meat of the paper, so I can learn from it and use it for my practice. So and that said, I never really read them end to end when I was doing academic work either, at least not at first. So the way I usually read a paper, so academic papers are usually set up in a very similar. So at the top, you have what's called the abstract. So an abstract is essentially a summary of the entire paper. Usually they'll put their findings at the bottom of the paper, at the bottom of the abstract, the findings of the entire paper. Read through that very quickly, because that'll tell you, is this paper relevant to you? Is it even talking about something you want to know? Because you don't want to read through 24 pages of thick academic writing with lots of $5 words in it, only to find out that, oh, this isn't relevant to me at all. You want to fail fast, exclude that. Oh, this paper isn't interesting to me. Throw that in the bin, move to the next one, right? So read the abstract first. The next thing I usually look at is the results. I go right to the end. That's what we want to know about, right? So for example, here in this paper, we can go down, 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 down. Let's see, excuse me. Oh, we passed it. So let's go up here to discussion. So sometimes they have a section called results. Sometimes it'll be called discussion. So this is where they will discuss their results and what it means. So usually within here, the results that you're interested, that this is where it will be contained, somewhere at the bottom. Sometimes it's called conclusion, sometimes it's called results, sometimes it's called discussion, sometimes they might have all of those in there at once. So right at the top, we can see, based on our analysis, we posit that data saturation had for the most part occurred by the time we had analyzed 12 interviews. Boom. That is what you're going for right there, right? That's your nugget. That's what you can take away from this paper right there. So that's why I went there first. Why read through 20 pages, right? Now, that said, now that you found something that is useful to you, relevant to you, and speaks to your issue, then let's turn this down a little bit. Now I would then explore a little bit more. So maybe, I would probably read through the rest of this discussion now, because I found a nugget. Now it's worth going through, right? Now it's worth reading more. So I'm going to go through and see what more they have in here. Maybe there's conflicting information or contradictory things that would put that initial finding in more context. Then the next thing I might do is I would take a look at their method. So if I'm gonna bet anything on the results of this study, let's say if I'm gonna go to my boss and I'm gonna propose a new product or, in this case, a research method or something, I want to make sure that finding that I'm bringing to the table has some relevance, some legitimacy. So I'm going to probably take a look at their method too. So, right, exactly here. The next section here is usually, it's in the middle of the paper and it's called method, right? So papers are usually broken up into abstract, introduction, then maybe a literature review. So it will summarize all of the previous studies and things that paper has referenced. So it kind of sets the current stage. And then method, so it describes what the work that they did. Then there might be a result. So these are this is just the raw data that came out of our study, and then there'll be a discussion or an analysis section that looks at, okay, what does the data mean? So for example, here they say we can get a sense of the methods they use. So it looks like in this case, they looked at HIV, candidates for HIV prevention in Africa. So what they did is we wanted to interview participants at high risk for acquisition of HIV and who would be appropriate candidates for HIV programs in the two study sites. So we interviewed women who met at least 3 basic criteria, were 18, had sex with few partners in the last month, had vaginal sex in an average week. So women, okay. So it looks like they're studying women in Nigeria who are at risk for HIV. So then let's look at here, data collection and analysis. So the interview guide consisted of 6 structured, demographically oriented questions, 16 open-ended questions, and 14 open-ended sub-questions. So they did interviews. Okay, let's see here. So data was collected between September 15th and December 12th, 2003. Interviews were conducted in English, Twi, and Ga in Ghana. So there was a number of languages used. So then, so transcripts were taken, and then they were reviewed by a principal investigator and translated. Then thematic analysis was performed on the translated scripts. So thematic analysis means they would go through and they would code utterances as being of a certain theme. So if they were like, oh, I'm having trouble accessing medical services because I don't have transportation. So maybe you would code that as transportation, because then you could look at all the interviews and then say, oh, look, it looks like transportation is a big problem for these individuals. So let's look at the experiment. So the methods section, the methods section refers to the procedure we used in our analysis, yet these procedures do not provide us with the data we need to determine the thematic development and evolution over time, and eventually the point at which saturation occurs in the data. So I don't know if they go into depth in this paper on what saturation is, but essentially what it means is no more themes arise. New themes. So they're saying if you ran 12 interviews and you had 10 themes, you could do a 13th interview, but you would probably just see more of the same themes over and over again. So that's what they're referring to as saturation. There's a few different meanings for saturation, but in this case, I think that's the one. So let's see here. Oh yeah, so they go through, actually, yeah, in this paper they talk about different types of saturation, and they're really specific about what exactly it is they mean. So what they did, so they looked at 30 interviews, right? They looked at a big subset of interviews. So after analyzing all 30 interviews from Ghana, the codebook contained a total of 109 content-driven codes, all of which had been applied to at least one transcript. So of the codes, 73% were identified within the first 6 transcripts. An additional 20 codes were identified in the next 6 transcripts for a total of 100. And the remaining 9 were identified with progressively less frequency. So what it seems to be like is that there's a diminishing returns. So the first 6, you get a whole bunch of themes, which makes sense. And then the next 6, you get, let's say, half of those. And then if you kept, it seems to be halving or something like a logarithmic or exponential, right? So essentially what this particular data set is showing is that after 12, they stopped learning new things. So it seemed like interview 13 through 30 may have been a waste, although they did get 9 other codes. But again, the question is, everything costs money. Research costs money and time. Do you want to spend a lot of time and money for those 9 codes when maybe we could have spent it somewhere else? Okay, so so now I think I have a good sense. So if someone questioned me, hey, how did they come up with that finding? Oh, you say 12, after 12 interviews, you've reached saturation. What does that mean? Well, now instead of looking like a fool and saying, I'm not really sure, what I can say now, because I've looked in that method, I can say, oh, well, you know what? The study that I'm referring to looked at interviews from a study in Africa, and they did 30 interviews. And what they found is after the 12th, they weren't getting any more interview themes, and that's what that data said, right? So again, it's not the law. It's not. It certainly might be wrong, but it's evidence in favor of this, of saying that 12 interview participants is enough to learn something significant, and to learn most of the significant things, which is what this study would seem seem to say. And so it's important, I think, also not to just look at one study. So that was just one study I posted, but take a look at other studies, because maybe other studies are saying contradictory things, or they're expanding, or they're introducing nuance. So let's take a look at this one, just to show you again how quickly you can look through academic papers. You don't have to read the whole thing. You just look at the abstract, look at the result, and say, oh, this supports the finding too. Put it in the pile, and then maybe we can read through the details later. So for example, here, this one says, this study examines 83 quantitative studies for the following purposes: identifying the extent, identifying optimal ranges for interviews. So what does it say at the bottom? Recommendations are provided for minimally accepted practices of justifying sample size. So let's go down to their results, see what they do. Ooh, lots of data here. Lots of numbers for us to read through. So, summary. It says, based on our examination, grounded theory studies should generally include between 20 and 30 interviews. There you go. So 12 is between, no, 12 is not between 20 and 30. But, so there's some other data. So and we could go through and see why in particular they're saying between 20 and 30. Oh, so another one here is a single case study should generally contain 15 to 30. So that's kind of closer to that too. So it seems two sources are saying somewhere between 10 and 30 interviews are good. So now we would be able to describe that situation. So how many, if someone asks you how many interviews do you need to do? So you could say, oh, on the high end it's 30, and on the low end it's 10. And so we found with experience that 12 is usually enough. Yeah, to me that. As a receiver of that information, I'd say, hey, that sounds pretty reasonable, and let's go for it. Okay, so that's my spiel on looking up and at academic journals for the purpose of user experience research. And then also we had a chance to quickly go through this particular study that looked at at-risk women for HIV in Africa, and it showed that after about 12 interviews that the new themes didn't emerge out of the data, and which supports interviewing around 12 people for qualitative analysis for the purpose of user experience or design research. So that's it for the Carmen Branje show for this episode. I hope you enjoyed this slightly different format. We're going to be back with a guest in the new year, Greg Samba from Loblaw Digital. He's a product manager, and we're going to talk to him about product management and the intersection between product management and user experience design. Until then, I will see you later.